Let's talk about the situation at the front, in particular in Pokrovsk, Donetsk region, where the Ukrainian flag is once again flying over the city council building. Assault troops from the Skelya regiment cleared this building of occupiers and raised our flag. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine noted that there is no encirclement of Ukrainian units and formations in Pokrovsk and Marnograd. Russian troops attempting to infiltrate Pokrovsk are being blocked by the defense forces, who are not allowing them to gain a foothold. Ukrainian defenders are also strengthening the flanks of the Pokrovsk-Mirnorad agglomeration's defenses to protect logistics routes. We will ask Alexander Musienko, a serviceman of the Territorial Defense Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, about possible developments at these locations. Mr. Alexander, welcome. Well, basically, Putin has already invited journalists there, and deadlines have also been set for the capture of Pokrovsk. Let's hope that this situation will remain the same, meaning that neither this settlement nor Mirnorad will be encircled. And regarding the Russian advance, our joint efforts with special units, including those from the regular army, will have their effect. But in your opinion, regarding Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, what possible scenarios could unfold next? What are the possible options for these two settlements?
Well, if we're talking about hypothetical scenarios, there could be various options, ranging from the best, the most positive. The most positive for us, of course, would be pushing the enemy out, who is currently directly in Pokrovsk, and we see those wonderful images when the flag is raised. And these are precisely the assault units of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the 425th Assault Regiment, one of the units that is operating directly in Pokrovsk, clearing and pushing the enemy out of there. Therefore, the first scenario is to push the enemy out of Pokrovsk, secure control of the flanks, and prevent the enemy from cutting off our logistics. That is, we stay and maintain control. And even as was the case in the Dobropillia direction, if opportunities arise, a gradual counterattack is launched and the enemy is pushed out directly from the flanks.
Let me clarify right away about logistics, because this is very important. We've repeatedly heard from the military that even if this road, let's say, towards Pavlohrad is not yet captured, not under Russian control, it is still under their fire control. And logistics are very complicated. Is there any guarantee that the situation won't change to our disadvantage?
Well, first of all, logistics are definitely complicated because there are a large number of drones, including those on fiber optics. But we need to understand that today logistics, as well as the delivery of, let's say, the most essential items that can be delivered, is carried out not only by land, directly by vehicles and so on. Moreover, I can say that the situation varies, and the issue of logistics was taken into account precisely when assessing how events are unfolding. And it is being carried out despite the fact that it is difficult and truly dangerous. So this would be a positive scenario for us, essentially the establishment of control. A negative scenario that could happen is that the enemy might be able to amass even more forces. And, keep striking this rock and eventually achieve certain results. And in the event that we allowed for the worst-case scenario, which could happen, it would be that the enemy would occupy Pokrovsk and Marnograd. In my opinion, the adversary would most likely then consider the scenario of further expanding offensive actions into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Not so much moving north to link up with the groups that are assaulting and trying to advance in the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration area, but rather, they would consider a scenario of advancing and expanding their foothold in the Dnipropetrovsk region, also attempting to reinforce the Novopavlivka direction. For what purpose? In order to, well, you understand perfectly, it's about spreading this psychological pressure. It's not even about military expediency, but psychological pressure to show, wow, they've taken Pokrovsk, as they would amplify it with their propaganda, and now they're moving into the neighboring region. That's why this would be the worst-case scenario possible. But overall, I can tell you that under any scenario, the Ukrainian defense has accomplished and continues to accomplish a very powerful task, because holding on to populated areas for so long under intense enemy pressure in conditions where we are conducting a strategic defensive operation, I want to remind you, we are not advancing, we are only carrying out local counterattacks, and practically every day there are between 10 and 15 counteroffensive actions by the Ukrainian defense forces in various directions. Even under such conditions, but to hold out for so long and stand firm despite the enemy's pressure, despite the fact that for a year and a half they have been advancing from different directions, trying to encircle Pokrovsk, well, that's already unique, that's already a serious, significant achievement. And this has already disrupted more than one scenario for the enemy.
Well, we've said more than once that the Russians are advancing slowly, but they are moving forward. And here we're talking about just a few hundred meters. But as for our counterattacks, there were cases when even we had the opportunity to push the enemy back by several kilometers. There were such instances as well, which demonstrates an incredible capacity for heroism and in general for active combat operations. Let's talk not only about the front line, but also about the rear. The main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense reports that our intelligence has information that the Russians have launched conveyor belt serial production of aerial bombs with turbojet engines, which can now fly up to 200 kilometers. Now I'm speaking directly about the rear, the threat to the rear. And this indicates that enemy aircraft, which are the carriers of these aerial bombs and launch them, may not even have to enter the range of our air defense systems at all. How threatening is this for our cities, frontline communities, and what can we do to counter it?
Well, even now they rarely enter the air defense engagement zone as it is. In other words, the enemy tries to operate from beyond our reach so that we can't hit them. We do the same. Our aviation, when launching strikes on occupied territories, military targets, or inside Russia, operates in such a way that enemy air defense, especially S-400 systems, can't reach them. First, regarding these aerial bombs. Well, in military slang, they're often called missiles for the poor. Because why is that? You have to understand that the cab, which is used directly on the front line against military positions up close, well, that's one type of aerial bomb. This cab is different. Why is that? How are range and speed achieved? By reducing the warhead size. If the warhead is reduced, it's no longer larger than, for example, that of a missile. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. No. But it simply means that the enemy gets an additional tool for striking, which they can use with their aviation. Just so there isn't the impression that this is something we've never seen before or haven't encountered. Unfortunately, we've seen many different strikes with various missiles. How do we fight this? There are 2 or 3 tools. The first tool is, of course, once again to reduce the Russian tactical aviation's ability to use airfields, delivering fire damage through deep strikes on Russian military facilities and airfields. Second, as of today, we obviously can't reach, let's say, if an aircraft is more than 70 or 80 kilometers away, we can't hit it. Well, it's difficult, let's say, to hit it with air defense systems. That's why we need to expand our network of available capabilities and resources, including air defense systems. And we do have missiles. In principle, long-range air-to-air missiles exist theoretically, which our aviation could use to target enemy aircraft. And these are the tools we have. There is also the tool of shooting them down with air defense systems, similar means. But for what purpose? For this, we need to increase the number of interceptor missiles. By the way, I can tell you that in Bydgoszcz, Poland, we have the Ukraine NATO headquarters, which is working specifically on improving the military component. They are studying what is happening and have conducted tests on shooting down KBs, including ongoing work to enable even interceptor drones to operate. Overall, I can say in general about air defense that it is extremely important for people, especially those in frontline or border areas. A very ambitious project is about to be implemented. This is in essence a wall of drones practically on the border. Now, as you know, a special air defense unit has been created within the Air Force, which will operate and focus exclusively on interceptor drones. For what purpose? The idea is that Russian drones, especially Shaheds, Gerans with warheads and others, will be intercepted right at the border by interceptor drones. In this way, we create a kind of sieve so that far fewer drones will make it deeper into Ukrainian territory. This is generally about strengthening air defense as well.
By the way, you mentioned Poland in passing, right? Poland is actually building its own drone wall without waiting for a joint decision with the Europeans in the context of the European Union and NATO countries in Europe. I have a question. What does that mean? Are some European countries and their leaders already moving toward unilateral decisions like everyone for themselves? Or how would you describe this?
I would say that, of course, those countries that feel the greatest threat, especially Northern Europe, the Baltics and Poland, are taking and are ready to take more steps because that's natural and normal. But I don't think these will be exclusively unilateral actions. So here, yes, we need to distinguish between Poland's sovereign right to strengthen its own security and defense, while also understanding the challenges that exist. That's obvious and that's clear. But at the same time, it's important to understand that Poland would like more support from Brussels, from NATO, in terms of strengthening their position. At the same time, look, there are armies within the alliance that, despite NATO summit decisions, fund their own armed forces in different ways. The Poles are among the leaders. Yes, the Poles are among the leaders. Yes, they are among the leaders. They understand that they need more weapons. They are signing contracts for their programs with South Korea for armaments, with other countries as well, building up their own resources, and taking the example of the territorial defense forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. They are also studying how national resistance works, how territorial defense brigades are formed, and so on, and they have every right to do so. But you see, again, on the other hand, NATO reconnaissance aircraft are operating in the Baltic Sea. They coordinate their actions, including those of US aircraft, with the Polish side. They can clearly see what is happening in the Baltic Sea. They see it perfectly well. They have increased their presence there, are conducting joint programs, so it cannot be said that this is done solely in response.
On the other hand, if the Poles have a drone wall, then fewer drones, if they head towards the EU, will reach Germany. That's the logic.
The logic is clear, yes.
2.5 minutes left. Let's also recall the mutual nuclear threats. Can this be called threats from the US and Russia? All the more so since I've been hearing this rhetoric like, Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0 several times already this evening. There is rhetoric from the first deputy chairman of the Russian State Duma Defense Committee, Alexei Zhuravlyov, who stated he does not rule out the possibility of supplying Venezuela with Oreshnik ballistic missiles. Let's recall what appeared in the information space, like the meeting of the Russian Security Council and Putin instructions regarding preparations for nuclear tests. However, Belousov, the Minister of Defense, said that they are already preparing a site in the Arkhangelsk region, but Putin's press secretary denied these claims. How can this even be reconciled with the Russian claims that they have good relations with the US in all areas when they're entering an arms race at the nuclear level?
Well, the thing is that Putin has no arguments for how to advance his agenda in relations with the United States right now. He thought he would be able to impose the paradigm that Ukraine is losing the war, that Russia is claiming influence in Europe because Russia has demonstrated its own strength. He hasn't been able to do that. So what should he do? The only argument left is nuclear weapons. And Putin is trying to play, including on certain generational characteristics and more, attempting to remind people what the Cuban Missile Crisis was, what the Cold War was like, how the world was on the brink of nuclear confrontation and what happened. Kennedy and Khrushchev met, and then there were other meetings. He is trying to create a negotiating position. That's all there is to it. And he doesn't have that many arguments, and the US doesn't want to. They say, okay, we'll respond to you with our own nuclear tests.